Hello, friends. This is the Alphalist podcast. I am your host, Toby. The goal of the Alphalist podcast is to empower CTOs with the info and insight they need to make the best decisions for their company. We do this by hosting top thought leaders and picking their brains for insights into technical leadership and tech trends. If you believe in the power of accumulated knowledge to accelerate growth, make sure to subscribe to this podcast. Plus, if you're an experienced CTO, you will love the discussion happening in our Slack space where over 600 CTOs are sharing insights, or visit one of our events. Just go to alphalist.com to apply. Welcome to the Alphalist podcast. I am your host, Toby, and today I'm talking to Malte Ubl about the future of frontend. Malte is a crazy German guy, I would say. Like he used to live in my hometown or close to my hometown, Hamburg. Built a conference in Germany, the JSConf.eu. And I think he actually learned coding or spent his first career years in the agency world, then jumped to California and worked as principal engineer at Google, which is like a very rare thing. So welcome, Malte. Was that all correct?
That's just about correct. Thanks for having me. Hi.
So you're also the father of AMP, that's what you worked at Google, accelerated mobile pages. And now you work as a CTO for Vercel. Did I pronounce it correctly this time?
It's Vercel.
Vercel.
But that's okay. We don't. Okay. We're very flexible.
Okay. So I would say this guy knows the front-end world very well and all the trends. And I'm really happy to have him here. So maybe you can tell me a bit more about your personal journey. Like, how did you get into computing? When did you start and why? And how did that crazy career path work out from Sinnerschrader to Google?
Yeah. Okay. You want me to start very early? So I started the way my career started when I was 14 years old. I started in a tiny software company as an after school job, and what they needed me to do was they made me do copying of floppy disk, which they would send to their customers, and literally printing out of manuals and then kind of putting them into distributable shape and so forth. So that's what I was doing. And then this company, which was a very advanced technology company, needed a website, and nobody there knew how to do it. And so I kind of taught myself building websites and kind of started my first programming job back when I was maybe 16 or so, maybe 15. I don't quite remember. So that was the earliest stage.
Was that the age of the marquee tech or center tech?
It might have even been before the marquee tech. I think I was excited when it was released. It was just around those years. Yeah. 90, 94, 95. I'm aging myself.
Okay, great. And how did that progress then?
Yeah. So I later switched to a different after school job. This was as a advertising agency, which is just opening their web department. I was employee number 2. Worked with that company through college and after. This was a place that it was big, but the web department was maybe 25 people when I left. I went from there to Sinnerschrader, which I can't pronounce, but if I have my English accent turned on, so people can mispronounce Vercel as well. That's fine. And so this is around the time when I started the JSConf.eu conference in Berlin. And that definitely kind of increased my personal kind of connections around the world by, at least an order of magnitude, probably 2 or 3, which then kind of led to my job at Google, which actually was in Hamburg. So this is actually a funny story. So Google had decided that they wanted to do engineering stuff in Hamburg, and I saw that and immediately applied, got the job. I started on a Friday because one of the weird things Germans do is that you start on the first of the month instead of on Mondays. I don't know. It's a thing, right? Obviously, everyone listening to this knows this. Idea. So it happened to be a Friday. I started there, kind of set up my computer because you don't start on Fridays at Google. Nobody like knew what to do with me, but I was like setting up things. I had my first ever video conference with my team at 4 p.m. on that Friday. And the news they told us was that they closed the engineering effort in Hamburg. And so I was immediately out of a job. So that's what happened. And so I had to find a new role inside of Google. At Google, you don't get hired for a job. So like if your job goes away, you find something else. Maybe that's not the case anymore as of maybe earlier this year when they laid people off. But back in the day, that was definitely the case. So I found something new, and I worked on the secret project Emerald C, which was the code name for Google Plus, actually. And that was a hot new thing. So because I got to like pick what I wanted to work on, I obviously wanted to work on the most like exciting new greenfield project. And so I joined that team, worked remotely for them for a while until I could get my visa and then transferred to the United States.
And then had the idea for AMP, or like?
That was much later, much later.
Yeah.
So I worked in a very specialized role. So my team's job was to render buttons into web pages, the Google +1 button, and from there I pivoted into building JavaScript infrastructure for first Google Plus, and I built a web framework called Wiz, which was not open source, so no one knows it. And that became incredibly popular at Google. So like basically every single consumer-facing Google web application is using it. So that was my job for a while. Then we kind of expanded this to building front-end kind of serving infrastructure more broadly, which was also very successful. So most of the newer projects are using that. And yeah, so the AMP stuff kind of came out of this. So, but I had a lot of experience with web technology, and so kind of just felt it would be interesting to scale some of the things I had been doing for Google to a much broader audience.
So that means like most of your biggest achievements are still running at Google and alive and kicking, and someone maintains it and it yeah
absolutely.
Just runs,
so there's a 20-person team maintaining the front end framework, probably something like that. And no, this is absolutely the king. And it's obviously like also, I mean, especially at Google, but I think overall something to be proud of if you do something and then it goes into some kind of maintenance process and survives over time. So there's a framework, right, that came out maybe like late last year called Quick. And it actually very explicitly wants to be basically kind of a kind of open source friendly version that brings some of the ideas of Wiz and combines them with the ideas of React and makes something pretty nice and worth trying for sure.
What are the fundamental ideas, or what makes a difference?
So the fundamental idea was that, if you have a lot of engineers, and in our case, Google Plus was like 1,000 engineers, and they would write code all day, right? And if you write code, you make your app slower, like almost by definition. There's no other way, and you make it bigger. Like even if you don't make it slower because everyone's a brilliant engineer, you add features, you make it bigger, slower to load, etc. And so the insight was that even if you need all these features, any given user is only ever going to use a tiny subset of those features in a given session. And so the way this framework works is that it only downloads the code for the features that you actually see in front of your face instead of every possible feature that could possibly be used. And so that's the base idea. If you folks using like more popular frameworks like Next.js, for example, are familiar maybe with a term called route-based code splitting, where you say each route gets its own bundle, and so you load the code for that particular bundle. So that's a more rudimentary version of the same idea, but it doesn't scale if a route gets very, very, very large, which large apps tend to do, because you really don't navigate around all that much. You like maybe like a Google Docs, it would be all like it's the editor, right? Like it's one route, and so. It's a more fine-grained fashion. Like in many frameworks, you can kind of manually tune things. But the idea was that in Wiz, that everything you would do would be automatically kind of lazy initialized by default. But that would be combined with like a model of programming that isn't terrible. Because typically, if you make things like very lazy, very like kind of asynchronous, then things become very, very complicated. And so we figured out a way how to kind of make things fast, but also make it easy to use.
Fast, but not awkward. Okay. And that was like at the time when jQuery came out and so on. So it was quite early, I guess, or?
No, this was around like, 2012-ish, 13. Right. So like it was definitely much later than jQuery. But jQuery was like still like very much state of the art. React came out around
2006
that time.
Or something, right?
Yeah. So it's definitely it had shown its years for sure.
Okay. And now you're working for Vercel, and you're the CTO. Like, are you still coding deeply? I mean, it seems as if you are like really like deep in the stuff you do, at least from like.
Yeah. So like my role is a very flexible one. And so the way I work is that I usually pick out 3, 4, 5 projects that I join, kind of try to make them more impactful, more aligned with the strategy, and maybe add an idea or two to up-level them quite a bit, and then I leave the team again. And sometimes that involves coding. So there's a feature that I built with a team of like 3 other engineers, because of the first thing that I did when I joined Vercel. And so there I very much was deeply involved in the coding. And still, if I find a bug or if I want a feature, I go make it. But this is not like my normal job. So in most teams, I only very occasionally contribute code.
Okay. And you just mentioned that you also contribute on the product side, which is a rare thing, I think, for like people coming from engineering, or it depends on the company. Would you say this has to become more of a common nature, that this happens?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. And it also, I mean, overall, I guess the way how do you organize a product org is something that is different in big tech versus like almost everyone else. Mm-hmm. And so, but I was obviously like kind of grew up within Google's product and engineering culture and certainly transferring that over to Vercel. And in that culture, there's obviously the role of the product manager, and there's the role of or the engineering department with various different specializations inside of it. But I think once you reach a certain like degree of seniority, you're responsible for the product. I mean, what else are you going to do, right? Like like it's not that someone else is making things up and then throwing it over the fence and it's only my job to implement it. Like I don't think that's actually a way how you can be successful.
Yeah, it's like there are lots of debates about the roles of product management versus engineering. Is it like orgs that run side by side, or is it like part of engineering, or the other way around? Like, what do you think about that? Is it like just interdisciplinary teams ideally, or how do you structure that ideally?
Right. I think like I think it's almost always the case that you want to, if you have a function like product management, which is by its definition smaller than its partner organization on the engineering side, then you run into these issues where if you kind of map the structure of how you work into your reporting structure, that within that, the PMs will be the odd ones out, right? Because most of their peers are engineers. The manager is probably an engineer and so forth, right? And so from that point of view, it makes sense to put these folks into their own dedicated organizations where they can grow and have career paths very dedicated to their function. But that, doesn't mean that you can't work super close together, right? And so I think you need to have a organization that's primarily like that has a reporting chain that's functional, but which has teams which effectively ignore this reporting structure and execute.
Work in a matrix.
Yeah, I guess that's what you call it. But like, I think the matrix kind of I think calling it a product team is actually easier, right? It's just a bunch of people and they work on a product.
Yeah.
And then
and ideally they collaborate, right? which happens if they sit together, right? I mean that, like in the remote first world is maybe a bit harder, but like I think if you just like put people in a room together, then that automatically happens at a certain point.
Yeah, I think what you want is that any person on this team that works on a product, first and foremost, sees themselves as someone working on that product. Like it doesn't matter. Like if that's the primacy, right? Like if that's what you do, then I think it comes natural that the reporting chain is kind of the secondary thing, where you go get your performance rating and where your manager tells you, how much money you're making. But otherwise, they're like not important, right? Like they are just this person managing you. But they might have a role on your product, right? Like they might be the lead of the product, in which case, of course, you're actually working with them, right? But it comes from the product side of the organization. It does not come from the hierarchy.
Mm-hmm. Maybe like little step back. Maybe like a few folks here don't know what your company is doing. Can you maybe just do a little elevator pitch here for us?
Yeah, no problem at all. So the way to think about Vercel is as the one-stop shop to develop and host your web application, website, web app, doesn't matter. The term that I've been kind of throwing around in my head lately is kind of the way to think about it is as a front-end cloud. So like it's the place that has all the services. It does your monitoring, it does your static hosting, it does your dynamic workloads, but it also supports your development process. I think one of the magical things about Vercel is that if you've ever worked with any cloud provider, like they have all these primitives and you have to learn them and they're slightly different and you have to orchestrate them, all this stuff. The promise of Vercel is you're a developer, you're building a Next, Remix, Svelte, Nuxt, whatever application, and it works on your machine, and we're going to take that thing that works on your machine, we're going to put it onto our system, and it's still going to work. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to know Vercel exists. But everything is kind of globally deployed on the edge and so forth. The other important part is the kind of the workflow around how you develop. So the modern development happens largely on GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, like providers like this. And the unit of work is the pull request. And so what Vercel does that every time you push a pull request, we will give you a URL. That's the version of your production website, but with a new code. So you can test it out, send it to your colleague, etc. And finally, the last thing, and I'm mentioning this primarily because I was saying there was this one product that I actually worked on myself. So if folks are, for example, familiar with Figma, where you send someone like a design and they can like collaborate on it and can comment on it and so forth, or you send them a Google Doc and people leave feedback there. So what we call preview deployment, so what you get every time a developer makes a change, is a collaborative surface like a Figma file. So people can leave comments, they can make copy edits, all this kind of stuff that you want to do when you have a new version of something. You want to tell people, hey, this is great, or here, maybe this needs to be a little bit bigger, or I found a bug. And you can do that in the context of what you're doing versus taking screenshots, posting them to Slack, opening issues. Like that's all kind of very, very old way of working. And so we're kind of bringing this like modern collaborative workflow into the end-to-end workflow for building web applications.
So the Figma of front-end apps.
Yeah,
Plus.
in the except that we like literally also then go ship it to production, and if you have a billion users, that's fine.
Yeah.
You don't have to.
Which is better than Figma, obviously. So it's essentially like the good old idea of having previews, right? Which I don't know, in the Rails world back then, like Heroku did initially through like PRs, generating a preview for each of your branches and so on. And maybe like in your case, it's even like for each commit, stuff like that.
Right.
Which like from my perspective is often something where people underestimate the effect, right? Like developers underestimate the effect. And I see so many companies, and unfortunately, I'm very close to a few ones that don't have that, right? Who don't have previews, who can't share like early stage work that engineers did.
Right. I mean, it's the way to think about it is exactly like in the old age of like Microsoft Word, or also like Photoshop, right? There would be this file, and you can collaborate on it, but not at the same time. And it's just similar where like I have a staging environment, and now it's mine. No, it's mine, and like you waste so much time over the process that's the modern way. Where I mean there is effectively infinite resources. Why would you not make a new thing every single time?
So if we talk about the future of frontend, then maybe this is the future of frontend, or what would you say? Where will it lead you, like with Vercel?
So in a way, it's almost table stakes, right? So I think the on the collaboration side, what we're trying to do is kind of make everyone more productive, right? And getting more out of the engineering resources are often the most scarce resource that any given company has. And so that's certainly a big part. There are, and I can go into arbitrary levels of depth if you would like, very exciting developments on the framework side. So like the way people build application is changing, and it's changing for the better. That's another big part of Vercel. So we're investing a lot into web framework development. And so we're not only like basically taking whatever people give us, but also make development better.
Which is next then, right? Next.js?
Yeah, so the framework we're building and kind of part of the founding of the company was Next.js. We also, for example, have the folks working on Svelte and SvelteKit employed at Vercel, but basically doing broad investments across the space.
Okay, and like a bit more in detail, what can we expect there?
So I think one of the I was talking earlier about how one of the benefits of the framework I built at Google was that you would have this property where things that people aren't using aren't actually taking up compute resources on the client, etc. And so I think one of the most fascinating developments that are kind of emerging as we speak is a technology called React Server Components, which kind of takes away the property of React, which was that whenever you loaded an application, even if it was server rendered, basically the client would say, I'm going to render this again. I'm going to diff it against what the server sent me, and then I'm going to boot up, right? And so the problem with that model is that if you have server-side rendering, you get a very quick visual response, but it's not actually interactive yet. So the app has to boot. And for that, the entire document has to load. You have to load JavaScript, and you have to run it, which takes up resources on the client. And so with server components, for those components that actually have no interactivity, they are free from a client perspective. And so you don't pay the cost in any way. And so that's similar to the framework I built at Google. What's very exciting about this is that I think it's a reality that again, programmer resources are scarce. People have to ship. They don't want to do things, even if they're like marginally better for UX, that make it take longer to ship. And so the benefit of these developments are that they really fit into the model of how people program in a way where it's just not more work, it's just faster. And so that's always a good property.
But isn't like since we all see ChatGPT being around, isn't it already time for next abstraction layer and us just writing specs for web apps, or just, I don't know, painting forms and just seeing the final result being built by other technology? What do you think about that?
No, yeah, I mean, obviously this is, I think about this a lot. And it's also an area that we're definitely investing in ourselves overall. But this is also like part of the answer is like, I call it a Cambrian explosion of startups that are happening right now in the AI space. And they're all on Vercel. Obviously, they're not all on Vercel, but like so many, like every day we're seeing like new startups spinning up on Vercel. And what they all do is that they build some kind of front end for some kind of machine learning AI system. And so certainly for the time being, the actual UIs that people build, they're handcrafted and they are automating some task, which obviously the AI overtakes. And so I don't see that changing anytime soon. I do think that, for example, the design phase is going to be heavily supported by AI. So like we're seeing this already, that that the mock generation phase can be prompt driven, and it's pretty obvious that works well. Like, I mean, it's not that different of a task from like more generic image generation. And so I think we'll definitely see support, but there isn't really anything even on the horizon that takes away the task of making a good interactive application. And then you obviously also still have to run it, right? So since that's also our business, we don't care quite as much whether you use ChatGPT to write the code. But I think it's for the foreseeable future, it'll make the developers more productive in helping them. But the fundamental kind of method of developing isn't going to change that much.
Okay. Yeah, I'm really curious how this will look like. I mean, it doesn't have to be a bad thing, right? Like for me, it's like overly positive.
It won't be a bad thing. It'll be amazing, right? Like it's all these tasks that you have to do, but don't really want to do. Like, write me tests, and it goes write you tests. Like, that's great.
Absolutely. Stepping back a little to like the front end world, like I'm an old Rails guy, so I'm sometimes a bit conservative, and want to provoke a bit. So I sometimes just think like, why do I need all of this? Like, why do I need SPAs? Why do I need like server side rendering as like an additional layer and so many apps I see? And then like, yeah, you can debate a lot about monolith versus microservice and so on. And why do you think like the state needs to be, or do you think the state needs to be in the browser? Like, do I have like something I get as like a benefit if I, let's say, take my WordPress blog and render a front end in Gatsby, like just as an example?
Yeah, I mean, since you're saying you're a Rails guy, Rails at least originally only supported server-side rendering, right? So it's
like in a classical way, yeah. And now like it turned into like rendering APIs essentially in so many cases. So
yeah, I mean it's one of the important things about Vercel is that like we are all about like dynamic web applications, and like so this pattern which is still popular and kind of what kind of derived out of a technical limitation is where you have these applications which are basically JavaScript files that call APIs, right? And that's easy to deploy because you need to deploy your APIs somewhere anywhere, and you have basically just a static front end server. But that really that pattern very much traded user experience for technical simplicity. And so kind of our mission is to give you something that doesn't make the UX compromises that's inherent with that technology, where like things load very slowly. You have this like, it almost looks a little bit like a Flash player with like a preload sequence. And so, but you get something that's easy to program as that model, but has no trade-offs for the user, right? And so, I think like all of these things are trade-offs, and you can't say, there's no one size fits all solutions. Like it's a different, like the answer is different whether you build something for your primary like e-commerce audience, or you're building something for the tool that your employees use to book their vacations, right? In the latter case,
absolutely,
you might have different UX requirements, right? And so I think it's important to tailor things to those requirements.
Absolutely. I'm just maybe skeptical looking at the fact that so many people out there just don't take that in account and just take the tool because they think it's cool, right?
Right.
And I mean, I think if you're very productive, like I think it's like the best thing is to look at your productivity and how can you deliver, like when do you produce like the best outcome. But I think that's also like in modern teams, sometimes something I don't see being reflected.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also like if you look at the personal decision making, I would also say that it's certainly something that you see, and I also think is something you can understand is that people say not only which technology is the best tool for this particular project, but also which technology do I want to learn is most marketable, right? Gets me my next job. Maybe I'm working on the vacation booking tool, but I really want to build the primary front end, right? And so I use something slightly over engineered to build the skills. This is certainly something that happens. Like people don't always make rational choices that are perfect for the given situation in isolation.
So what would you say are the strengths and weaknesses of modern front-end stacks? And yeah, I mean, you already answered like why you wouldn't take like Laravel to build your app in most cases, but you favor the front-end side.
Yeah, I mean Laravel, that's a front-end framework, right? It's fine. Good, use it if that's what you need.
Yeah, in a way, right? It right. Just like uses different.
I should clarify when I say front end, right? What I mean is, between 1 and 1 million servers running your application, right? And the client, but not the stuff behind those servers, right? Like so, there's like maybe 2-3 layers depending on how complex you are. That's the front end, right? And further back. These are relative terms. At Google, we always said everyone's a front end engineer, except the people working on Bigtable, because they're building a database, and everything else is just a Bigtable front end, right? And so these are very ambiguous terms. So when I'm using it, I'm definitely meaning like the serving infrastructure that communicates directly to users.
What would you say? Like, I see many teams like writing stuff in different languages. How do you see that? Like productivity wise, having this split in between functions, like front end versus back end, essentially, like you already clarified that a bit with the Google perspective, right? How do you see that?
Yeah, I think so if let's say I'm the principal engineer of a team, the thing I would most care about is that the number of languages is small. Right. So it's I would say like if my overall team is just 10 people, then there is no argument that it can only be exactly one, right? Like you cannot have two languages in a 10-person team. But let's say you have 100 or 1,000 engineer team, then I think the number could be 2 or 3, but not more, right? So I think it's actually interesting how we do it at Vercel. So basically we write our front-end apps in TypeScript, and there's no exceptions. We write our serving infrastructure in Go. We write actually our non-critical path backend logic in TypeScript, and we write our developer tooling in Rust. So that's stuff that runs on the developer workstation or laptop themselves. And so these are all very different trade-offs, right? When we build developer tools, they have to be as fast as possible. And so Rust is a good choice, right? But Rust is not a good choice to build a serving system because at least if you're a serving system building company, because we build so many features, like you want a productive language. And so Go is much better. But it's also fast, right? It was made exactly for this task. And so I think that's a good choice. And then we kind of fall back to TypeScript as our default language. But so I think so we're at 4. which I think is definitely the absolute max. But we also have very like strict rules around when you apply which. If teams have more languages, or they don't have clear rules around when you use which, for example, or if they have bad rules like team A uses this and team B uses that, then that's just bad, and it's a leadership problem to fix it. But also, like, again, like it's because Rust is kind of very much on this side, right?
Yeah.
It's basically there's a team writing Go, and then everyone else. There's a group writing Go building the serving system, and everyone else basically writes TypeScript.
From my perspective, it's also like absolutely okay, as long as one is not on the critical path for the other, right? Like if you're waiting for someone, like let's say you're building like a traditional web app in a 10 people team, and you're just waiting for, let's say, the Rails guy to implement your GraphQL API as a front-end engineer, it just doesn't make sense, right?
Exactly, for sure.
So then maybe that's a good rule of thumb. What is like right now your influence as CTO at Vercel? Like you basically influence like all pieces of the application, or I mean, you essentially already told us that you like jump into different teams every once in a while.
Right.
Like what is the stuff that interests you most?
So I definitely don't put my own interests first. So this is entirely based on what's most impactful for the company. And also, like,
obviously,
we're still a startup, right? So I also ran our yearly strategy planning, and I kind of obviously review the roadmaps that across all teams and so forth, right? So that's another big part. So I think like the way I think about the role is it's both a technical and a product leadership. So whatever, in the end, kind of deciding what is being built is something I do for sure.
Thanks a lot. And what is like, I don't know if you can actually disclose that. What are like the next big building blocks for you personally in your journey there?
Yeah, so I mean I obviously can't disclose our future product roadmap, but I can talk about it maybe in somewhat abstract terms, and also kind of around my personal thesis around kind of the direction that software engineering should go in. So I think one of my personal insights, and you can say if I'm right or wrong, but what I've seen is that the way how BigTech is operating their applications, that their consumer-facing applications, is very scientific and very effective. Like they're very good at measuring whether improvements are positive or not. It's a very, very professionalized, very scientific workflow. And so my experience is that even if you go from these like $100 billion revenue companies down to the billion, $10 billion revenue companies, that there's a huge gap in the fidelity with how people operate their web front ends. And basically, I want to close that gap. I want to give everyone, whether they make $1 billion revenue or just a few million in their web store, I want to give them the tools that are as effective as the ones that Google has, and want to make them able to run their business in the same effective fashion. And so that's what we're going to do. Okay.
And your thesis on how software engineering should be, is that what you want to do, or?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few insights that we're gonna bring to market for sure. But I think as a good example is, I've seen like everyone's doing A/B tests, but it's so common that people are not able to actually measure the impact of their change. Even if what I've seen at Google. So literally, my team, we didn't mention this, but I was running Google search on desktop. So my team would run experiments. We would have maybe like 20 at a time, right? 25 to 50% of experiments had issues in the setup that are very, very subtle. And I think this is extraordinarily common. So what happens is you run an A/B test, and your result is positive or negative. So I think if it's negative, people go dig deeper. Why? But if it's positive, it's very common to say, yes, okay, go, let's launch it, right? But again, like in almost half of the cases, there was actually a mistake made that's very subtle in how the experiment was set up that had a bigger effect than what you were actually measuring. And so people have to learn how to kind of overcome this confirmation bias, where just because the result is good doesn't mean it's actually good. The other thing is, it might actually be bad, but then organizations have to be mature enough to actually overcome the sunk cost fallacy, where it's like, you just worked 6 months on a feature, has negative metrics. What do you do, right? I think my thesis is that today most companies are going to ship it anyway. Like they're going to find a way to lie about the results. It's the same problem as what you see in kind of scientific papers where people do p-hacking and things like that, right? Like you can make the numbers do what you want, right? And so it's an application, like it's a maturity thing for a company to be able to make decisions in a way that actually makes sense. Yeah, I mean, you were also asking about like the future, or like the like changes in software development. Like one of the things that I actually worked on as well was solving the problem at Google that, in my particular case, but you can actually generalize this very broadly, you would have these hundreds of engineers and they would write front-end code, but they weren't experts, right? And so it was very difficult to scale anything really, because like, how do you do you want to teach them? No. Like, do you want to review all their code by experts? That's like very much of a bottleneck, right? Like, so we had to find out something. And so we found a way, based on the insight that engineers are very used to fix compile errors, basically, that was very effective at scaling software engineering knowledge. And so that's another, I think, interesting piece that we're looking at bringing to market.
Cool. What would you say are your 3 biggest learnings at Google?
I mean, I was there for 11 years, right? So I learned almost everything I know from Google, right? Like leading Google search was a very humbling and crazy learning experience, right? So, and in particular, actually, desktop was interesting because Google had not invested much in its desktop experience for years. And so we didn't even have metrics for shipping features that were working well at the time when I joined the team. This was because basically all the metrics assumed that what's on the screen is what you pay attention to, which on a phone, that's probably true, right? But on a laptop, it's not true. Like you can see 5 search results, and we have no idea which one you found most interesting, right? And so because no one cared, like we had to kind of start from scratch, learn how to operate this like multi-billion user daily active product. And that was very, very interesting because I was like, I mean, as we've talked about, I'm like an infrastructure person, right? Like, so I had never run a consumer product. So that was very interesting. And I learned a lot, right? I learned a lot about metric design, about how to validate metrics. There's a lot of proprietary things I can't disclose from Google, but it's very fascinating how well it understands user behavior, for example. So that's a big deal. Like, I think, I mean, working at Google was the first time I was dealing with, building infrastructure for teams where the number of active, like daily active software engineers, like in the company, was in the thousands. And it definitely teaches you a lot about like what kind of changes are effective versus what doesn't work. But also then, I think you can always bring it down to something that's applicable for smaller teams, because because obviously these thousands of people don't all work on the same stuff. And I certainly learned how to scale web applications to a very, very large scale, and that's also still what I'm working on. So it's very useful knowledge.
Yeah, I can imagine. And if you could give like a few recommendations to our listeners, how to manage frontend better and maybe the infrastructure better. I mean, obviously, move to Vercel, right?
Exactly.
That's the first thing, and some more potentially.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, yes, everyone should move to Vercel. I think we talked about the preview deployment workflow. I think it's not something you cannot have, right? Like the impact on productivity is immense. I was talking about the commenting feature, which actually has much more impact than you would think, right? It kind of, you think it maybe substitutes for a Jira ticket or like a Slack message or so forth. But what we really see what happens is that people note things which otherwise they would just not have bothered to ever say is a problem, right? And that's actually very important in polishing applications to a state that's actually, I think we think, at least at Vercel, very important, that things are like actually really, really good. And so getting that last mile together is something that's very difficult with like kind of the legacy process. And then maybe finally, I think, very actionable advice. I think what is a well-known thing in the market is people are kind of chasing the next hotness and are constantly swapping out their infrastructure, and that's almost certainly a bad idea, right? Like nothing happened in the last 5 years that was sufficiently big of a change that it would be worth a migration, right? Like that's going to take you a month or two, even if you think you can do it in a day, and it's just going to destroy productivity in a way that it will not gain you back.
Yeah, many teams just do that, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, you can spend your entire career doing this. It's a fun job, right? It does not.
Yeah.
In non-dysfunctional companies, it does not get you promoted.
So, I still have, as an outro question, like a little surprise for you. Your CEO Guillermo actually told me about a hidden feature in Next.js. It's actually a yarn task that is called Time Machine, and what it does is like very descriptive name, right? It lets you travel back in time, and you can then like choose your character and travel back in time. We do that now. We choose you as a character in the year 2008 when you just started working as a technical director for Sinnerschrader, and we now observe Malte for a little while, like still coding a lot, like helping build up the company, build up the agency. And you now have the chance to whisper something into young Malte's ears. What would it be?
Very interesting question. I mean, isn't the answer always buy Google stock and etc.?
Potentially, right? if you're into stocks, or Bitcoin or whatever,
Bitcoin probably even better, right? We're just coming out of the financial crisis, so that was definitely an interesting time. This is like, those were the days, right? Like, it was a really interesting time. I was at Sinnerschrader. I was working primarily on demandware projects, which is like a system that's called Salesforce Commerce Cloud now. And, I think it was, back in the day, it was Rhino based, which was a very early server-side JavaScript technology. And that was amazing. Like, I don't want to change anything about it. And then just after that, I started my conference, went to Google. There's actually very little I want to change about how these things happened, except maybe buying more Bitcoin.
And Google stock, obviously. And sell it now, please.
No, last fall. I guess 2021.
Sell it last fall, yeah. You're right. So, Malte, thanks a lot for being my guest here. Like, lots of interesting input. Happy to have you again soon, hopefully, or maybe meet you in Hamburg. I don't know if you're around every once in a while.
I'm coming every year.
Okay, yeah. Then,
even through the pandemic, it was very interesting travel stories happening there for sure.
Can imagine. Yeah, then let's do that. Have a great day, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you. This was fun. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Thank you for listening to the Alphalist podcast. If you like this episode, share it with friends. I'm sure they love it too. Make sure to subscribe so you can hear deep insights into technical leadership and technology trends as they become available. Also, please tell us if there is a topic you would like to hear more about or a technical leader whose brain you would like us to pick. Alphalist is all about helping CTOs getting access to the insights they need to make the best decisions for their company. Please send us suggestions to cto@alphalist.com. Send me a message on LinkedIn or Twitter. After all, the more knowledge we bring to CTOs, the more growth we see in tech. Or, as we say on Alphalist, accumulated knowledge to accelerate growth. See you in the next episode.